recompensa. Benvinguts. Estava dient, pels que esteu més lluny, que sou uns valents, perquè tot el dia de marató, de diferents xerrades i taules rodones, però aquí esteu. Si us n'heu perdut alguna, ja sabeu que totes s'enregistren, amb la qual cosa les podeu recuperar a la web, on fins i tot també fem articles amb un petit resum de cadascuna d'elles. Demà és l'últim dia, hem fet un munt de coses en aquests 4 itineraris, hem fet possible que això sigui una bienal de veritat, perquè s'ha tornat a repetir al cap de 2 anys, amb aquests itineraris en democràcia, futur, ciutat i aquest que és el de tecnologia. Amb totes les mesures de Covid ja sabeu que desinfectem les cadires quan s'acaba una xerrada, l'altra. Gràcies per tots portar la mascareta, jo ara la recuperaré. I res, que estem realment, tot l'equip de l'Institut de Cultura de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona i tot aquest Consell Assessor de Comissaris molt contents. Com per exemple dins d'aquest itinerari de tecnologia que la comissària, la Marta Peirano, ens ha triat el càsting per aquesta taula rodona que s'ha anomenat Cap nom és innocent, on es reflexionarà sobre el llenguatge com a primera eina de transformació de la realitat. Diuen que el llenguatge tots ens hem posat d'acord per dir que això és una taula, que això és una ampolla, que això és una cadira. Ara ho veurem. Ho farem amb el sociòleg Carlos Delclós, que serà qui conduirà el debat, la Valerie Miles, editora de Granta i especialista en la imaginació com a vehicle de transformació social, i l'artista visual nord-americana Kirsten Stoll, que de fet ella tenim 2 versions. Ens entrarà en remot a través de vídeo formant part del debat, però primer ens vol presentar com un vídeo enregistrat, que és com si fos una obra. Ell, al ser un artista visual que treballa el collage, mireu, justament també Rafa Fan de Madrid ens ha fet el collage, que és la imatge gràfica d'aquest any, doncs ha volgut, ja sabeu qui investiga la propaganda corporativa, la política alimentària, la biotecnologia, té col·leccions per diferents museus d'Estats Units i veurem aquesta peça com inèdita que ens ha fet expressament i després comença el debat. Endavant amb el vídeo, gràcies. Gràcies.
My name is Kirsten Stolle, and I'm a visual artist from Asheville, North Carolina, in the United States. I make text-based collages and works on paper and short video and audio animations that dissect the rhetoric of agrochemical companies Bayer, Monsanto, and Dow Chemical. I'm really interested in how they position themselves as modern agricultural companies while concealing their toxic past. My process is such: when I start a new project, I generally spend the first few months gathering information and researching. I scour the internet looking at writings by journalists, scientists, academics, and poets. I spend an inordinate amount of time scrolling through corporate websites and highly produced TV commercials. You'll see I often work in a series, and many of my projects incorporate language and text that I take directly from corporate marketing materials, such as websites or brochures. I'm also a big fan of eBay, and find it a terrific source for archival photographs, magazine advertisements, and just general chemical company ephemera. And my goal with all my project really is to deconstruct the chemical company's messaging and expose their persistent greenwashing. My project, Monsanto Intervention, consists of a series of redacted and collage magazine advertisements from the 1940s to the 1960s, and it was one of my first projects where I really started examining why a chemical company would be interested in getting into the farming business. I wanted to understand how the company that provided chemicals to the U.S. government during World War II and the Vietnam War was able to transform itself into a multinational pesticide empire. The mid-century ads that I sourced would have run in places like Time Magazine and the Saturday Evening Post, and they targeted their chemicals to a really wide audience, ranging from housewives to use in the garden or for the upcoming war effort. The ads that were quite nationalistic and militaristic provided a terrific jumping-off point for me to reframe Monsanto's narrative. And by collaging cut strips of black paper over the original text, I was able to redact the text and alter Monsanto's intended messaging. And the final reconstructed ads highlighted Monsanto's spin and the U.S. history of overusing harmful agricultural chemicals. On June 4th, 2019, Bayer placed a full-page ad in the New York Times defending the use of their chemical herbicide glyphosate, also known as Roundup. This was in response to the hundreds of ongoing glyphosate-related U.S. lawsuits going on at that time, and that still continue today. I was interested in reproducing that ad several times and then intervening into the ad either through cutting or collage, redactions, or annotations to resurface their past and call out their revisionist history. In my most recent project titled Slogan Poems, I've extracted marketing slogans from the brochures and websites of Bayer and Monsanto, and then recontextualized those phrases within the framework of current online news reports.
Hi, Kristen. So, I guess we don't have audio from Kirsten yet.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
So, as we start this session, the first thing I'd like to do is thank the Biennale de Pensament, and the folks at Fabricot for making this session happen, and especially Marta Peirano for the invitation and for putting this session together, which I think is only becoming, the topics are really only becoming more relevant by the minute, as I think we'll see as the session kind of moves on. We've heard a little bit about Kirsten, and we heard a little bit about Valerie, but I just wanted to get into a little bit more detail. Valerie Miles is a publisher, a writer, translator, and co-founder of Granta en Español, as well as a director of the New York Review of Books and its Spanish translation. She's responsible for introducing a number of prominent Spanish authors into the English language readership, and vice versa. She's a bit of a smuggler of words and ideas and thoughts in this way. In 2012, she curated the CCCB's exhibit on Roberto Bolaño's archive, and in 2014, she published 1,000 Forests in One Acorn, which is a beautiful anthology where 28 Spanish language writers, very well-known Spanish language writers, chose a selection of their own work as representative, with comments by the authors and discussion of their influences. As a translator of words and ideas, Valerie's quite attuned to the uses of myth and language in the pursuit of different types of manipulation, especially political manipulation. Meanwhile, as you've heard and as you've seen, Kirsten Stoll is a visual artist working in collage, drawing, and installation. Her solo exhibitions include shows at known projects in Berlin. She's too humble to tell you that in her video. The Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art, and Catherine Markle Fine Arts in New York City, among many, many others. In works like No Risk to Public Health, which you just saw, Deconstructing Jansen, and my personal favorite, Revolutionary Control, Kirsten uses techniques of extraction, redaction, excising, erasing, cutting, and collage to dismantle the narratives pushed by corporations, especially agribusiness and chemical companies, in their pursuit of power and profit. And in that process, one of the things that I really like about her work is that it often reveals a more naked motivation, which is the same motivation of any sovereign power, which is namely the freedom from consequence, an exemption from justice, or any meaningful notion of accountability. There's always a theme of displacing risk towards others that I've found quite at the center of her work. And at the center of politics and culture as such is the power to name our world and its content. Both Kirsten and Valerie have addressed this power in their work in provocative ways. In her introduction to a very special issue of Granta titled Por espejo oscuramente, Through a Mirror Darkly, kind of a little nod to Philip K. Dick there, Valerie cites Mandelson's claim that the dream of science is to depart from a mess and explain it with a simple formula. I think we're seeing this in real time today. Mountains are not cones, clouds are not spheres, and rivers are not straight lines, yet we use these abstract forms to comprehend them. In the current pandemic context, we're witnessing an intensified attempt to name our world and the content. The new normal is how it's referred to by different power holders, and the population is called upon to internalize these different parameters. I'd like to start our discussion with a broader question begged by the title of our session. No name is innocent. The title of our session refers to the power of language, the abuse of which Orwell summarized so effectively in 1984. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The new authoritarians that are rising all over the world seem to know this, and it often feels like they're the only ones that are actually exempt from nuance. Meanwhile, those who oppose them, we have to be very, very careful about what we call fascism, what we call racism, what we call sexism, right? Or what we call a concentration camp, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez found out quite recently when she referred to immigrant detention centers, which are concentration camps, quite literally. Corporations play similar games with language, as Kirsten's work shows, telling us how to feel about their products. If I take McDonald's word for it, I'm loving it, this eternal present of heavily processed meat and exploited workers. So with that in mind, my first question to both of you, and I'm going to start with Valerie here, would be, how did we get here? How did those in power or those seeking power use language to protect what they have or acquire more? Has this changed at all in recent years, and how?
Thank you very much for the question. Hello, Kirsten. It's very nice to see you.
Very nice to see you too.
And to be here with you so far away, technology making this possible. And thank you, Marta. Thank you to the Biennale. It's very nice to be here. Language is really, it's a huge subject. So you can kind of get at it at so many different angles and talk about it in so many different ways that sometimes it's actually hard to kind of make that small area and decide where you're going to talk. But perhaps it would be good, first of all, to realize that language, when we're saying language, when we're talking about language, what exactly are we talking about? And when we talk about language, of course, spoken language is the fact that I'm here on stage making hissing sounds, and my tongue is clucking, and as I exhale, and hopefully COVID-free, the vibrations of the sounds that I'm making reach your eardrums, and in your eardrums, your brain turn them into thought. So the fact that what I am saying, all of this hissing and this clucking, turns into an idea and a thought, it's very important to realize that that's happening inside of your mind, right? So there's an invasion, in a way, that is taking place. My words and the system that creates these words turn into a system by which you are giving sense to reality, okay? So that's spoken language. And then, of course, we have written language, which is, in fact, spoken language captured in signs. And we also have to consider that language is probably the greatest technological revolution that ever happened. Yet at the same time, we really don't know that much about it, where it came from, when it came. It's probably one of the greatest problems of science as yet. We don't really know the language phenotype. We don't really know if the brain came first to facilitate language, or whether language facilitated the brain. So there's so many things that we
we don't know really about language, and so we studied it in a lot of different ways. Now, because it has this kind of magical and mysterious property, and the power of coming into our minds and establishing a kind of reality, of course we know that power can take that and turn it into ways that benefit their ideas, no? I think it's interesting, though, to look, for example, in that issue of Granta, we opened by we were talking a little bit, we wanted to talk about reality, no, today, and language. And the through a mirror darkly phrase actually comes from a book in the Bible in Corinthians, which is in the same area, verses, same series of verses where the idea of love is talked about, love being the greatest of all things. But I think it's important, too, also to understand that St. Augustine, for example, he used this idea of through the mirror darkly, because talking about there being a space between the human and what is, in his case, God, right? But we can understand God as being reality, we can understand God as being the void, we can understand God as being many different things if we want to continue this through metaphorically. And language, Augustine he talked about language as being words, as you were mentioning, as being simply the naming of objects, right? And then the naming of objects in sequence. And Wittgenstein, as a matter of fact, in Philosophical Investigations, he actually kind of brings up the fact that Augustinian thought creates the idea that words are only the naming of objects without there being the syntactical and the semantical levels, that mean that language is not just a series of naming, it is also systems. There's systems, several different systems, from bodily systems to neurological systems to environmental systems that all kind of coincide and create this one thing that is called discrete infinity. Discrete infinity is what makes the difference between human language and any other. It's what makes language human. Discrete infinity means taking from a number of small things, discrete things, and infinity, which is kind of like a mathematical inductional process. It takes from a series of finite words, you can create an infinite number of possibilities because of the systems that can go into creating them. So I just thought it was kind of important to bring kind of to the fore the fact that it is, of course, when we name reality, we are giving an object a name, and then it becomes something. And we're doing that a lot. We're doing that a lot in technology. We're doing that a lot in the political field now. But it's not only the naming of things, it's the naming of things in a system to create an infinity.
Kirsten, I'd like to get some of your thoughts on this issue, and if you could kind of, I think what Valerie says is actually quite suggestive in the sense that there's this kind of something of a transubstantiation that takes place,
yes,
right? Where utterances can suddenly take on the role of physiological properties,
exactly,
right?
Because
and this notion of language as an invasion, I think, is quite interesting as well. So Kirsten, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. And I want to say thank you very much to you both for doing this, and also to Marta for the invitation. It's interesting that you use the word invasion, because one of the things that I've been digging into with Bayer and Monsanto is their use of language when it comes to talking about weed management. They talk about weeds as invasive. So I can talk about that a little later, because I think that's an important way to talk about the multiple meanings of language and positive and negatives. I would say, for me, one of the things that I try to do when I'm looking at various things that you term language or text is to really figure out, as a viewer of some marketing materials or messaging, in my case from a corporation, what is it that I'm looking at? And then to kind of dissect what's really behind it. So there's a particular use of a word that the corporation might use, but what's really behind it? And in fact, is that what they're really saying, right? So that translation, I think we're going to talk about a little bit. If that makes any sense?
Yes. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this emphasis on systems is actually very, very important too, because your work, Kirsten, actually reveals kind of the systems behind, or sort of the back end, which is the systems behind what ultimately gets to you as a consumer or
right.
as a layperson when you read one of these kind of corporate full-page ads in the New York Times or what have you, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's this constant, I think there's this constant play, actually, and it's a perverse type of play by corporations with language that kind of transmits a great sense of security. It's intended to create a great sense of security for the reader, while at the same time it's actually shifting all risk to them, right? So if you use our product wrong, that's on you, right? Glyphosate.
Glyphosate.
Yeah, sorry, I want to say glycophosphate or something, but anyway.
Yeah.
Glyphosate is not inherently toxic, and I think actually in the last few days here in Spain we've had a similar situation. In this city they just shut down bars and restaurants, and there was a really compelling phrase here from the local businesses associations talking about this, saying, bars don't infect people, it's people that infect people, right? Well, what's a bar without people?
Yeah.
It's just a warehouse for booze, right? Like, I mean, let's name that a little bit differently. So I'm kind of interested, I mean, I want to keep pressing on this point of the political use of these languages, of language, because yes, there is a system behind it. And one of the things that I'm actually very curious about is, what is the nature of some of these systems, right? What is the nature of the type of language, of the system behind the types of language used by a Bolsonaro in Brazil or by Donald Trump in the United States? Or, closer to Spain, by the goofy nameless, who I refuse to name because their name actually steals the notion of voice. What's behind these systems, or what is their nature?
Well, we could talk about, for example, neurolinguistic programming, NLP.
Of course.
I think that's very interesting because it was a little bit of a revolution that happened about, in the 70s and 80s, when they started the first kind of people who were starting that, Richard Bandler and Grinder. They were studying the idea that actually in cognitive behavior, there are certain patterns of belief specifically that repeat themselves. And in these patterns, if we're careful and look at these patterns, they can be persuaded to be different. In the beginning, it wasn't meant as necessarily being something to be taken up by marketing or politics, but they defined a series of different ways where you could persuade, and it's not rhetorical persuasion. It's not the use of argument. It's the use of these patterns of cognitive behavior that can be changed. Then, some years later, and I think it's really interesting because the actual title of the book, I have it here somewhere, but it has magic in the word. The first one by Bandler has magic in the word, and the second is called sleight of mouth. And sleight of mouth also has the title has magic in it. So I thought that, first of all, that's very interesting. Now, sleight of mouth kind of takes some of these ideas of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, a step further. And what sleight of mouth, I don't know if anyone knows sleight of hand. I don't know how to say sleight of hand in Spanish, actually.
I actually don't know how to say that either.
Sure. Sleight of hand is what magicians do when they're playing. And they're doing a trick, and they bring you over here so that you're not seeing this hand, and then they bring you over here so that you don't see this hand, so that they're constantly in movement, in motion, in order to give the illusion of, well, a coin showing up behind your ear or whatever. That's called sleight of hand. So Burke wrote his book called Sleight of Mouth, which gives a certain series of procedures that can allow you to persuade someone else against their own beliefs. And in fact, this idea of sleight of mouth has moved into certain areas of sales, quite specifically real estate. Real estate. And where did Donald Trump come from? Real estate. One of the interesting things of sleight of mouth, one of these series of means by which you get someone to change their mind is fatigue. The idea of giving opposites and then fatigue, so that one knows that the fatigued mind is not ready for critical thinking. So a fatigued mind, slowly but surely, will simply say, okay, just because I don't want to fight. So real estate, in the 80s, more or less, there was this big revolution in real estate sales using sleight of mouth techniques. And part of what sleight of mouth is called is actually, in fact, hypnosis. It's called conversational hypnosis. So it's meant to be subversive. It's meant to be done subliminally in a way that the person who's being operated on by the sleight of mouth is not aware of it, but is broken down slowly but surely by these procedures. And they often talk about this kind of like mesmerized state that someone can be in when they're trying to make a decision over buying a car or buying a house or buying something like that. And for me, I don't know, Kirsten, if you would agree, but the first years of the Trump presidency, I mean, if you read what are the techniques of sleight of mouth and you see exactly what the Trump administration was doing with the press, it's exact. I mean, it's not anything, that just happened innocently in any way. And I do think there was like a certain kind of mesmerized audience for a couple of years there in the very early years of the Trump. I think there was like a hypnosis going on where nobody really knew how to take it, what to do, what to say. Do you agree?
I think it's like the shiny object syndrome, right? It's like we have so much going on. This guy is going to solve all the problems, and he's all this shiny, and he's wealthy, and he's this and he's that, when in reality, he doesn't care about anybody but himself. But because we live in a society that is soundbite, Twitter, memes, everything like that, people are just trying to live their lives, provide for their families, so they're going to latch on to something that seems sort of possible with a big P, like big, right? Like this guy could help me, or in the case of pesticides and Monsanto and Bayer, they will help me grow more crops. Really? Okay, they're sustainable, environmental, regenerative, all these buzzwords that the words themselves are good, but the way the corporations are using them is completely disingenuous. And it's just, to your point, distracting, right? Distracting from their history of providing Agent Orange, providing DDT, providing all these other nasty chemicals, right? We're just going to put that aside, and we're going to distract you with all these pretty buzzwords. And then we're going to take an ad in the New York Times, and we're going to defend this really toxic chemical called glyphosate, where they had 125,000 plus lawsuits against them, and 3 damning lawsuits for cancer patients wins against the company. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there was actually a moment that I recall very early in the Trump administration where the reporters, White House reporters and any of these folks, pointed out that they had to change how they transcribed how this man spoke, because he doesn't finish sentences. He doesn't finish thought. He doesn't even finish the beginning of sentences.
Right.
He's constantly moving from one thing to another, and it's, you know, you want to talk about fatigue. I think the transcribers were the first ones to get to really reach both a physical and mental fatigue. And there is definitely a hypnotic kind of element to it. And I wanted to kind of, you were touching on it just now, Kirsten, but I'm kind of curious, what other patterns have you noticed in the communicative style of corporations in using these words? So kind of, you know, we have this kind of hypnotic element that's present in hucksters like the president, or hucksters like real estate agents. But I'm kind of curious about, you know, how do they pull this off from the corporate world? Can you get into a little bit of the techniques and the patterns that you've, you know, observed?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, I would say, in the 21st century, of course, with the internet. Not only is it language, but it's language plus image, right? Because we're very image-based, right? Instagram, Facebook, everything, videos, 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. And if you I was going to say, if you hop on Monsanto's website, so just for everyone, in case they don't know, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company from Germany, bought the chemical company Monsanto in 2018. So now they have merged. What is interesting about that is that Bayer wants to distance themselves from the Monsanto name, such that 2 days ago, when I went to hop on the Monsanto website, it has disappeared. So they have disappeared the Monsanto name because it is so, for lack of a better word, toxic.
Toxic, yeah.
But back to what I was going to say about the text and the image. If you had gone on Monsanto's website, and now if you go on Bayer's website and you go to the farm, they call the farming part, or the, you know, sustainable agricultural part, it's beautiful fields of corn and happy farmers. And of course they have people of all skin tones and ethnicities in the fields, right? With words like regenerative and sustainable, and we're doing all this stuff for climate change. So if you don't really know much about this company and that's what you see, you think, great, like that looks wonderful. Like, oh, they're providing food. Bayer is a chemical company. They are not providing food. They have seeds, which farmers grow, many of which are genetically modified. But the language that is used and the images that coincide with it, they have this very sophisticated, curated machine to make us, the viewer, see something, in my mind, that is fairly untrue.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting too. This is really good because you're kind of expanding on a point that Valerie brought up as well, which is that, you know, when we talk about language, perhaps it's in our nature, perhaps just it's in our social conditioning. I'm not going to get into that, but we're automatically brought to the kind of the textual, right? This idea of text, but language is very much multisensory, right? In this way, where yes, text plus image is kind of like this, you know, this way of communicating that has become much more powerful in the 21st century, perhaps. And I keep thinking about these new authoritarians. I'm going to keep bringing up Trump because I mean it resonates very much with a lot of imagery that I have in my own head from my upbringing in Texas. That, you know, when I see his puesta en escena, his mise en scène, his presentation, I'm immediately, you know, I'm thinking first of the image of him taking off his mask recently, which just looked comically masculine, excessively, and then his speeches or his videos where he's kind of explaining that, you know, I had COVID, I had to do it, and I beat it, and all this kind of stuff. And the images, they remind me of two very specific things. One is advertisements for reverse mortgages. where they are talking to seniors and trying to scam them out of their own house and into more debt. But the other thing it reminds me of is days when I was at home sick from school, and the commercials that they showed during the day, during daytime talk television, of lawyers for like injured workers, right? Like of just really sleazy kind of figures. But at the same time, he evokes this mythology of white picket fences, industrial jobs, and all of this kind of stuff. So I'm there's a mythical element or an archetypal element to this, this shiny object, because he literally surrounds himself with shining objects as well. What's the role of myth in all of this, right? What mythology is being evoked, and what is so appealing about myth that it seems people are quite drawn to it, and that language kind of needs it.
Well, I think you're right. Language has, again, it's got many different systems, and Trump has there's a lot going on when Trump speaks. For example, he repeats the same words over and over again. So you actually, now Trump speak, we understand it. We understand his words, like beautiful is one of his words. No, he has a speak. He has a lexicon, a Trump lexicon that we know exactly what it is, and we can almost, while we're listening to him, finish his sentences for him. Sometimes I wonder if that's why he doesn't finish it, not because he couldn't, but because he wants us to. No. There's also an element of the cadences that he uses when he's speaking, and they sound like a preacher. They sound very much like, an old Bible-thumping evangelist in a tent. And I think and he does that very seriously because he's speaking to his base, which is full of evangelicals, right? There's something very much of the kind of the figure that, since he was already famous, he already had fans. There's a difference between the people, his base, they're fans. They're fans who like to watch his television shows. And so he's somehow been able to turn that into something where now he sounds a little bit more like a preacher, not like a president. And that touches something very deep, I think, in the American psyche, because whether you like it or not, American discourse began as a Jeremiad. And that's what he's doing constantly. It's a constant Jeremiad, that he's touching these kind of very deep-seated things in American culture. And you can go back all the way, really, all the way back to the Salem witch trials and the men that put those women to death. And if you follow in American history, there have always been like two currents. There's always been, on one side you have the Concord group and you have the Transcendentalists, and on the other side you have the other side of the ones that were pro-slavery and, in the Civil War, abolitionists and pro-slavery. You have the people who were like land grabbers and, interested in taking the lands away from the Indians, and then you have the Transcendentalists. And it's always been going back and forth. And Trump kind of represents that side of the American equation that is over there. And they remember these, these evangelical moments of even the people who were against prohibition, kind of also had like an element of the religious there in a country that doesn't really have one single religion. I remember Susan Sontag used to say, in the United States we have faith, we don't have religion, and unfortunately Trump has kind of coalesced an area of the Christian religious right, and when he speaks, that's what you can hear. So I think that's one very important thing. And luckily, when I talk about imagination, imagination, when I talk about this discrete infinity, which is what allows humans to use language in ways that come out of imagination. Steiner talks about the if, in grammar. That's what differentiates us from being able to tell a story about reality that's not reality itself, but a metaphor of reality or an analogy of reality, or we can go off and make counter stories, So right now, we're in a period of time where we have this one story of this kind of uber preacher, secular preacher who's taking over politics, but then we also have Lilith in the Me Too movement. And I think one of the great myths of our days is a search for Lilith versus the Eve factor. But I won't go into it so that Kirsten can.
Kirsten, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this issue of myth.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it's the invented story, right? So Trump poses as Valerie was saying, like almost like a preacher, even though he's the opposite of that. But his base or people that resonate with him, they just think he's that. Like there's no outside construct of like, maybe he isn't what he says because I'm just a follower and I'm just a believer and whatever he says must be true. And I find with the chemical companies, it's a similar thing. So they've put it into sort of, I'm just going to say the American, but it might be global as well. In the case of Monsanto and now Bayer, they've put it in this sort of like collective belief that more chemicals are better, right? People are starving and we need more chemicals to grow more food, which in actuality is false. But if you have been telling that through your websites, through your marketing materials, through possibly farmers that buy the seeds from Monsanto and Bayer and buy the chemicals from Monsanto and Bayer, and they're caught up in this cycle of having to buy seeds, having to buy chemicals, super weeds come up, they have to buy more chemicals and they can't save their seeds. You start to believe that like, well, maybe my yield isn't so great, but it's a little bit better. So I'm just gonna keep literally buying into this corporation that is telling me this story, right? This myth, this invented history that I need chemicals to produce more food. And if you just keep saying that, people just keep believing it, until people like me, small artists, and other people, advocacy people, start calling them out and saying, wait a minute, this isn't true. Like there's other parts of the story you're not hearing. And that's the trouble I have. It's like, I'm an artist and I'm not a scientist, but I'm looking at stuff from a critical eye, and I hope that people come to my work and can take their own critique afterwards. But I'm a small person in a big pond, and so it's like, I'm hopeful that there's NGOs and other folks that are doing stuff to kind of strike down that myth and show that there's other ways of, in this example, providing food that doesn't involve a lot of chemical inputs.
Yeah, but I think even the discussion, it's a trick of sleight of mouth in a lot of ways. The way that chemical companies get us to talk about chemicaling our way out of hunger, out of world hunger, is very similar to this idea that Trump promotes of, or Bolsonaro, or here the fascists who want to, bring up this imaginary of a Christian Spain that was much more, much better. There's various elements here, right? So they get us to talk about their specific myths and ignore, for instance, that perhaps it's not chemicals that need to solve issues of world hunger. It's another distribution of power, and it's an end to American imperialism, which is the reason that Monsanto even exists as it does. Sabotaging food production networks all over the world, right? And no one even talks about that. And I think, over the last decade, whereas in the, I might sound weirdly nostalgic for someone my age, but in the 90s and early 2000s, we were talking about Monsanto and within the context of a broader discussion about globalization and about the destruction and sabotage of food sovereignty in countries all over the world. Now we talk about it from from a public health perspective more often. Like the issue of GMO, the discussion around GMO foods in the United States is whether or not it's healthy or good for you. It's not whether it's actually good for other countries that, right? I mean, the issue of it potentially being good for other countries is used to justify its potential public health implications in the United States. So what I marvel at sometimes is the ability to kind of get us to talk about other sets of mythologies with other characters and old conflicts rather than broader global issues. When Trump first kind of emerged, one of the things that I thought was like, well, if you really, to me it was not a surprise because I'm from a red state. My whole thing was everybody was asking, well, how did this guy get elected? And I just thought, did you not know what your country was like outside of the cities, guys? Like, I mean, this is what it is, And I'm pretty sure that in Brazil it's a similar situation, and in Spain it's a very similar situation. I wasn't surprised that, some of these actors have emerged, which, gets us to this issue of looking beyond our borders, right? Languages and myths are bounded, and their borders are very heavily policed. National language academies will tell us which new words are real words, right, or acceptable words in our official languages. And self-proclaimed patriots will tell us who our real countrymen, who the real America is, right? I like to say that both the ICE agent and the coyote have a use for a translator. So I'm kind of curious, whether we're talking about the translation of words, ideas, or stories, what's the power of translation in this context, and what's the power of the translator? Not just between languages, but between contexts, types of knowledge, etc.
Well, translation, as the word translation means to bring across, to bring across. Sometimes I think of Sharon, of the boat raft bringer with the coin across the river. Translation, there's so many different forms of translation. For example, anyone who plays music coming from English, we know we use the words "every good boy does fine" to know how to speak musical language. The line notes on a treble clef, or FACE, the line notes on a bass clef. We can remember those because we put names to them, and remember them that way. So that's a translation from language to music, But from language to language, and this is probably going to prompt one of the last questions, but I like George Steiner quite a bit. He has an idea that it's called the Hermeneutic Motion, and it's a movement in 4 parts. That's what he says translation is. Translation, and it's first based on trust, which is like fundamental for a translator. Trust, and then it's aggression. And he takes this idea of aggression from Hegel, the idea of that any acquisition of knowledge is aggression. That's what Hegel says. But Steiner looks at it as like you're taking all of the syntax, you're taking the words, you're pulling them apart, a little bit like what you're doing, Kristen. You pull it all apart until it just becomes this big chaos. And then the third part is when you begin now re-embodying, and putting this chaos together, but now a little bit on the other side, and then finally it's restitution, where you began, the language you began in becomes the new language. The reason he talks about this is because sometimes people think translation is paraphrasing, right? And it's not paraphrasing. If you're paraphrasing, then you're not translating. Some people think it's supposed to be exactly the way it is in one language. It should be in the next language exact, which it shouldn't be. It's a movement that has to do, and the translator has to make the choice about whether you're going to stay closer to the author or closer to the reader, which means am I going to pull that significance over closer to the reader so they can understand the text? Or do I keep it a little bit closer to the author where it remains a little bit estranged, no, from the target? So this process, it's quite a complex process that happens, and especially when you're going between languages, no? And all of the cultural ideas that go between one culture and another culture, no? And the writer, they always say the writer is supposed to be the Geist of you know, kind of captures the Geist of a culture. And that Geist sometimes is very, very difficult to translate. But I don't believe that you know, translation is impossible. It's just not easy.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought this up, Carlos, because I never thought of myself as a translator. But as we're talking and as you posed this question, I was thinking interpreter, and sort of like, I feel like I'm an interpreter and a translator of propaganda. You know what I mean? Or bullshit, if I could say that so nicely. And I feel like I was talking to my husband the other day, and I was like, I feel like it's propaganda literacy school or something. You know, it's like teaching people how to suss it out, right? And my little niche happens to be agriculture, but you could put this on Trump. You could put this on any other media ad. You could put this on any messaging that you would get in Spain. And for me, the translation part comes with looking at something at face value, like what are the words actually saying, like in the example of that New York Times ad, and then looking at the context of it, and then also looking at who's behind it. So if I'm reading a study from the University of Arizona or something, I read the study, and then I look at who funded it, right? So there's that, I'm interpreting the study, because I'm not a scientist, but just as a layperson, but then I'm also looking at who funded it that could affect how I'm going to interpret or translate what I'm seeing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I brought a little, in the 2003 edition of 1984, Thomas Pynchon wrote the introduction, and he was talking a little bit like what I was mentioning before about the imagination being this place where we're able to kind of come up with alternative universes, right? And I just thought I would write, because I think it leads in a little bit to what we were going to say in a little bit, but this is, and I quote, he talks about how literature can, and in the case of 1984, which we can bring up to date with the Newspeak and everything that we're talking about now, about language, right? And he says that a lot of people like to go through 1984 and say, well, he got this wrong, well, he got this wrong, well, he got this wrong, you know, this one he didn't quite get right. And so he's kind of defending the idea that it's not about that. He says, specific predictions are only details after all. What is perhaps more important, indeed necessary, to a working prophet is to be able to see deeper than most of us into the human soul. Orwell in 1948 understood that despite the Axis defeat, the will to fascism had not gone away. That far from having seen its day, it had perhaps not yet even come into its own. The corruption of spirit, the irresistible human addiction to power were already long in place, all well-known aspects of the Third Reich and Stalin's USSR, even the British Labour Party, like first drafts of a terrible future. What could prevent the same thing from happening to Britain and the United States? Moral superiority, good intentions, clean living, no, in the sense of what we were talking about, fascism, no, and how the fact that a lot of the words we can't use because they've been kind of stripped of their meaning, because they've been used so often in contexts that were not the ones that they're made for. So we repeat words like, well, like fascism or like the Holocaust, and all of a sudden these things kind of lose their their meaning, but the point isn't just the word that we're using, it's the whole kind of spirit behind that word and what we're trying to translate. In this case, we're translating temporally, no?
Of course.
A work that was written a long time ago, but we're still reading it and translating what it has to say today. And it still has so much, it's so seminal to what we're living through today.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that has kind of happened since the publication of 1984 specifically is that we've been kind of, we've once again been drawn into another myth, or discussing another myth where like every generation has to kind of create its own lexicon and its own words to talk about its own phenomena. But when you think about it, that book was not really in the arc of human history. That book is not that old.
Yeah.
Nor are the impulses that it captures. So if we don't have, if it doesn't map perfectly onto our current situation, it might be because our language has changed a lot more than the situation has. I don't know if I'm making myself quite clear, but the idea is that maybe we've bought this need for buzzwords that actually kind of appeal to us generationally and make us feel exempt from sort of some of the metrics of the past, or, in terms of what's just or unjust. And I kind of wanted to like wrap up before we move on to some questions from the audience. There's just one last kind of question that I wanted to throw out here, which I think discussing Orwell again and the use, for instance, of war metaphors. Ursula Le Guin, who, may she rest in peace, once said that, or in power, let's say, once said that when faced with a word that we've grown tired of, we have a couple of options. The first is to confront it and to fight against it. The second is to realize that conflict is not the only human response to a situation, and to begin to find other metaphors such as resisting, outwitting, skipping, or subverting. So I'd kind of like to know, just as a short answer, I guess, what's your preference here? Do you prefer confrontation? Should folks like me insist on using the word fascism to talk about Trump or something like that? Should we subvert their language? Should we just ignore it altogether and start our own commons?
Well, I think a short answer for me would be, I've always thought of more than confrontation, like a greater insult than confrontation is indifference, right? But quite unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of indifference these days. We have only the luxury of choosing between a lexicon, what we consider the best strategy, right? And that's the beauty, like I said, of this discrete infinity, is the fact that we have so many different building blocks to decide what is going to be our strategy. Right. I tend to think that, of course, everything depends, but if you don't have power, confrontation is not a very effective way, because without power, confrontation doesn't work. I would say subversion is probably a little bit along those lines. And I know that through lexicon, subversion can be extremely, extremely effective. And I think that our storytelling, I think fiction, allows exactly that. And I think the fact that she was talking about how rich language can be by giving all of these different words for something and all of the different nuances that are there, and the fact that nuance is possible is exactly why personally I've dedicated my life to fiction, and why I think storytelling is so absolutely important to confront reality.
Absolutely. Kirsten.
Yeah, I agree with Valerie on the confrontation, and lately it's hard because of all the politics. I veer on the indifference part, or just like checking out part, For me, I think I don't know what the verb would be, but to offer a counter narrative, right? So a counter narrative, reframe what's being said. So I guess that's a type of subversion in a way, to offer a difference, because if you're only shown one way and you're not shown a different way, or maybe several ways, you're just going to go with that one way. So, and I think to Valerie's point of fiction, artists are really good at that. They're really good at offering up stuff that's too scary to talk about in a different way, right? And people are different learners. People are visual, auditory learners. And I think that's, for me as an artist, where I come in to offer a little bit of a difference that way.
Do we have any questions? I think we have two speakers that are firing on all burners right now. No. Yes. Here we go. Oh, we have a microphone, I think.
Structure of Magic. The Structure of Magic is the name of the book that I was talking about on neurolinguistic programming.
Sure.
It's really quite interesting if anybody wants to look more into that.
Anyone else?
No questions?
No?
Quiet audience.
Well, I think we can, quiet audience. I think
We've taken their words away.
Yeah, I think that, or we fatigued them with a lot of different
exactly.
ideas.
We did a little sleight of mouth here.
No, this was actually, I want to sell you guys a timeshare now. Maybe
it's call now. It's exactly the kind of discourse that we're having now. And now that the elections are in. I don't know, I haven't been, because of COVID, I haven't been back to the United States for quite some time. For me, I go back and forth, and so I haven't been there for a little while. And I swear I don't recognize, you're in California, right, Kristen?
No, actually, I used to be in San Francisco, but now I'm in Asheville, North Carolina.
You're in Asheville now.
No,
I vote in North Carolina. Do you vote in Carolina?
Yes, and I already voted.
I did too. All right, two of us.
Yes, I actually I had an absentee ballot and I drove it to the elections office because I do not have faith in our glorious U.S. Postal Service.
Jackson County over here.
There you go.
But it's very true. I think just as long as we have a couple of minutes, if nobody has a question.
I think we have to.
Do we have to?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say, I do think it's quite interesting to watch how Trump has taken language and used it. And sometimes I think we think he's really, really kind of stupid. And actually, I think he's a lot smarter sometimes than we think.
I think we learned that 4 years ago.
I think we learned that 4 years ago.
So anyway, just thank you all for showing up today under the circumstances. Thank you so much to the organizers for making this possible, and thank you to our two amazing speakers today. I found this conversation just wildly stimulating and interesting, so thank you all so much, and thank you to the organizers, for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Moltes gràcies, doncs. Només dir-vos una cosa, la Bienal s'acaba demà físicament, però serà sempre a la xarxa, totes aquestes xerrades des del primer dia enregistrades. I per molt que veieu que els actes de demà molts tenen les entrades exhaurides, si realment us va molt la vida, feu la prova de venir, perquè a vegades la gent reserva i després, per coses de darrera hora, no ocupen les places, és a dir, que pot ser que tingueu possibilitats del que es fa aquí o en altres espais poder-ho gaudir, d'acord? Doncs proveu si sou valents. Moltes gràcies.